Rory, it's good to see you again.
It's nice to see you too.
Yeah. What I wanted to do today is have a chat with you about the management of deer, particularly looking at Sika, or you'll probably correct me and say Sika type deer, in woodlands in Scotland today.
Yep.
And how it's likely to go in the future, and to see if some of my assumptions are accurate, and if not, if I've maybe gone off in the wrong direction. So
the future's more tricky. I don't keep a crystal ball handy, but I'll do my best.
So for openers, I'm very much of the opinion that deer management in Scotland has changed drastically from when my career started, believe it or not, 40 years ago. So what I'd like you to do is just give us a quick overshot of how you see it has changed.
Well, I think the government policies have certainly changed more towards, perhaps back towards viewing deer as more of a pest than an asset, and certainly within state-controlled areas of ground, I think there is a tendency towards not zero tolerance, but minimal tolerance. I think on private land, certainly in the Highlands, there has been a shift in that same time span, because it's about as long as I've been back up here working. There's been a shift from private landowners feeling that they can manage to their own objectives only, towards a situation where both the landowners and their full-time stalkers are trying to balance their own objectives with a more sensitive management which has a lower impact on the environment. I think the tricky situation remains and will always remain in the lowlands of Scotland, where we've got a very different pattern of land ownership, and coordinating the management of particularly roe and fallow in those areas, and increasingly red, gets much more difficult, because the land holdings are very much smaller, the deer are moving regularly between land holdings, and that sort of coordination is currently lacking.
I mean, it's well put, and that's kind of how I see it too. One of the questions following on from that, to my mind, is in all the policy we see, I mean, deer are one of the main bits of legislation that we seem to, as a country, come back to again and again and again. A lot of the focus of legislation, in my mind, seems to be on the open range. But from what you're saying, you suggest that that's probably an easier thing to manage sustainably than a more fragmented Scotland.
It's an easier place to enforce policy because the number of land holders is that much smaller. Whether or not that's the correct approach, I think in the past landowners, particularly as the generations have shifted and the older generation of both landowners and stalkers have given way to their offspring, who have a much more open view of environmental sustainability. I think as far as that has changed, I think they've been quite willing to go along with the initial pressure from Scottish Government to manage in a more environmentally aware way. I think if the government pursues its current policies, and this is obviously a personal opinion, but I think if they pursue their current policies much further, they will end up alienating that goodwill, and the landowners will start to dig their heels in and say, you've pushed us far enough.
Would the science support that?
It's not a matter of science in that case, and that's why I said it's my opinion. It's more a question of people's reactions to being pushed into a corner. Most private landowners who have deer on their land are managing them for their own private objectives, as well as trying to accommodate public objectives. If the public objectives come to dominate to the extent that they can no longer realise their own land use management aims, then inevitably they're going to start to resist, because they are paying in large part for the management of these deer populations, and if they're not getting the returns from it that they're looking for, why should they continue to pay?
It seems very logical. I agree with that. So in the terms of this, and we look at all these plans that have been talked about for Scotland, you're probably the best man to explain to me why, and there's a lot of people that are watching this that are just coming into this, so you could say sector, pastime, occupation, profession, hobby. What makes deer different, and what makes different species of deer different? Well, do we look at them all as deer in Scotland? Because everything we read that talks about deer in the public interest and deer management, really we're talking about different species of deer. And
sadly, they do all get lumped together in the legislation, apart from the open and closed seasons, and even that is becoming closer and closer in Scotland for all the different species that we have here. I think it's unfortunate because ecologically they're very different, not only in their feeding style but also in their social organisation. Roe deer, as you know, are largely relatively solitary. Males are even territorial in the breeding season, and females have limited home ranges which may overlap with those of their offspring from previous years, but they again are essentially solitary. Compare that with red deer, which even in woodlands tend to go around in groups, and certainly out on the open range are highly social animals. So you've got a distinction between feeding style. Roe deer are very much selectors of highly nutritious morsels of easily digestible forage. Red deer, Sika deer for that matter, fallow deer are bulk feeders who can cope with and can easily digest relatively coarse forages. So you've got that difference for a start, which will affect their impact. And you've got this social difference that you've got roe deer spaced over the ground individually, and you've got red, fallow, to a lesser extent Sika, going around mob-handed and covering very large home ranges, so that they're moving in large groups across the environment with a much heavier impact where they do occur, but then leaving a gap behind them where there is relatively no impact because they're all together in one aggregation. So yes, I think it makes a bit of a mockery to try and treat them all the same, but then legislation has to be simple. So inevitably you make compromises.
Mm-hmm. So we hear a lot about, and I'm going to ask you a few questions on this one, and you'll keep me right here. We hear a lot now about alien non-natives, and we have this vision now of returning Scotland to probably about a post-boreal period and having native species that were here roaming the landscape. In that, without going into the rewilding thing directly, in that sort of the one that comes up in the deer world as the sort of alien non-native, and it's on this ICUN most invasive species list, is the Japanese Sika. What's your opinion on all this?
It's on IUCN's list. It's not on the European list. It's not on the British list of invasive non-natives, where the definition is quite clearly an animal, an introduced animal whose range is expanding rapidly and which is having a very clear negative impact on the environment. So according to that definition, none of the UK species, as far as I'm aware, are invasive non-natives except for muntjac in England and Wales.
Okay.
That said, I suppose there are two things I would say. First of all, you're never going to get rid of them. And secondly, I read a very interesting article not so long ago, as I think I mentioned to you once before, where they were actually looking at the environmental impacts of native and non-native species of deer, specifically across Europe, with the presumption that non-natives, since they haven't evolved in the environment in which they now find themselves, don't have the compensatory mechanisms and therefore are much more likely to have a negative impact on agriculture, forestry, conservation interests than are natives, which have evolved within these systems. But the interesting thing about this article, and it was really quite convincing, was that there is in fact no real difference between natives and non-natives, and there's no good evidence that non-natives have a heavier impact per se than do natives. Having said that, there are very few native deer species left in the UK. Red and roe are our original natives, but most populations of those, certainly in England and to a large extent in southern Scotland, have either been reintroduced with animals from English deer parks or of continental origin for red deer, or have been tinkered about with genetically by people introducing different genetic types to try and improve antler quality for red deer, for example. For roe deer, they've used continental imports, certainly across much of England where they were exterminated in the Middle Ages, reintroduced only really in the 1800s and thereafter. They've reintroduced a foreign genotype in order simply to establish populations. So to what extent we actually have many native deer species left in England and to an extent in Scotland is a questionable one anyway. They're almost all messed about with and therefore to some extent could be regarded as aliens.
Interesting. So if we could dispel, because we're going to come back to this regularly in the film we're putting together, I'd like to either agree or dispel some myths. The Japanese Sika, when I spent time in the Forestry Commission, foresters saw him as the forester's enemy because he was the one that did more damage. There were tales that their digestive tract was different to a red deer, that it was longer than a red deer. Is this all bunkum? Is this just...
No, it's not bunkum that they can cause more damage, but per unit individual, they are no more damaging. I think the significant thing is that they are capable of building up extremely high densities. They are, as you know from your own experience, very difficult to control, but even without that, they are, as I say, capable of building up higher densities than typically red deer can in woodlands. I know areas in the UK where there are densities of upwards of 35 Sika deer per square kilometre in wooded environments. At those sorts of densities, of course, the number of mouths, irrespective of how much each individual animal is taking, the sheer number of them means that they are capable of inflicting quite a lot of damage to commercial forestry.
Mm-hmm. And are they still healthy and
yes.
fecund at these sorts of densities? So it's not a case they'll breed themselves to extinction?
Nowhere in the UK, and this is the only species for which I think this is true, there is nowhere in the UK where Sika populations have shown any signs of density dependence, by which I mean that when they reach a certain density, fertility declines, calf survival declines, adult mortality may increase as a response to that increased density. In almost every British species of deer, you see that suite of factors coming into play when they start to reach the carrying capacity of the environment. Even at 35 to 40 Sika deer per square kilometre, there is no evidence for any reduction in fertility.
So that's potentially what's given them the reputation of being the menace.
I think it's complex because I think they not only reach these high densities, but they're clever. They're very good at staying unseen and unrecognised. By the time you realise you've got Sika in your forest, they're probably already present at quite high densities. It's like muntjac, you don't notice them at low densities, so by the time you do notice them, you've probably got a substantial resident population there. That's not quite the case on the open hill or in open habitats. There you become aware of them quite early on, particularly because of a pattern of dispersal where young males seem to migrate in a wave of expansion well ahead of the main population. So you'll have a population core which builds up a certain density, and when it reaches the density where perhaps the young males are not getting enough food, they have no mating opportunities, so they're I suppose, evolutionarily designed to think about dispersing further afield, the young males will move out well ahead of the rest of the population and are usually encountered in ones and twos or threes about 15 to 20 kilometres away from the main core of the population. So they come out first, and you would then become aware of them, because suddenly, particularly in open ground, suddenly you start to see young Sika stags in areas where you've not noticed them before. But in wooded environments, they're far harder to track. So you wouldn't necessarily notice.
So this leads me to another question on the subject. Again, they're a close cousin of the red deer.
Yes.
So we'll come back to hybridisation in a minute. But behaviourally, they're quite different in the way you get the almost semi-territorial behaviour of the Sika males, which red don't seem to be the same. How distinctly different would you describe them?
I'm not sure that I would, and certainly in the reproductive stakes, almost all species of deer are much more flexible than they're given credit for. So fallow deer, for example, are typically regarded as territorial in the mating season. Individual mature males set up a rutting stand, a small territory, which they defend against other males, and they roar that deep guttural belch to attract females, and they copulate with estrus females who then move on. That's the typical view, but in fact if you look across the UK, you will find some fallow populations doing that. You'll find some fallow populations holding harems of females. You'll find some of them even where the territorial response has dwindled to such a small space of ground, literally no larger than the one we're sitting in, that they're actually lekking. You've got perhaps 30 or 40 animals, each with a minuscule territory, and each juxtaposed one next to the other. And yet again, you've got other situations where, particularly where female densities are relatively low, you'll have males literally wandering the ground, wandering over quite a large range, looking for estrus females. So you've got that whole spectrum. And as we've learnt more and more about the way that the mating strategy adapts to density of competing males, density of females, habitat, we've realised the same is true for other species, so that while again we usually regard red deer as setting up harems of females which they defend against other males, there's situations in Central Europe and in Spain, I don't know of any in the UK, but certainly in those other countries they set up territories, just like rutting fallow bucks are supposed to, rather than holding harems. Sika are exactly the same. You've got exactly that same flexibility. In some situations they will set up breeding territories where a male holds an area of ground and whistles to attract females. In other situations they set up harems. In other situations again, a male will wander through quite a large area, mopping up any estrus females he comes across. So I think I used the example of mating strategy since you picked that up, but I use that simply as an illustration because I think in almost all aspects of their behaviour they have this huge flexibility.
Highly adaptive.
Yeah. So that's what makes them successful.
So that what we're basically looking at is all of these different types of behaviour could be going on simultaneously in the one area.
In the one area, possibly one or two. I mean, in the New Forest, where I used to work in Hampshire, for example, then you will have certain areas where fallow bucks will form a lek. You'll have other areas where they hold traditional territories, and you'll have individual males foraging for breeding females. But that tends to be in different areas of different habitat style, if you like. I think in any one area of a constant habitat and deer composition, deer density, deer sex ratio, then you will tend to find that one strategy is the optimal one.
Okay.
It works.
Yeah, understand it. So from that, I mean, the next question I would like to ask, and obviously you rocked me the other day when we spoke about this, and I realised that, like most people, I was guilty of this vision of the Sika red hybrid. And I've seen some classic examples, I think we all have, of what looks like a red deer cut off at the knees. And a lot of traditional Highland stalkers had this vision of this hideous creature that was the Sika red hybrid that just looked like a dwarf red stag. And you made the comment to me, I was talking about Japanese Sika, and you said, well, they're not really Japanese Sika anymore, Neil.
No.
So take me through
Right.
hybridisation of what it
You're
looks like.
talking about stalkers and hunters thinking about the damage that this hybridisation could do to the traditional red deer stag, and maybe because they've got smaller antlers and a smaller body mass, they would ruin the genetics and the appearance of the traditional red deer stag. It doesn't quite work like that. That was a false fear, if you like. Red deer and Sika do hybridise. They're perfectly capable of producing fertile offspring. But actually, where they occur in relative abundance, they prefer to breed with their own type. So that if there are plenty of Sika around, Sika will breed with Sika. If there are plenty of red around, red will breed with red. What tends to happen in the hybridisation, and it tends to be these young Sika stags dispersing ahead of the main population that I was talking about earlier, they come into the edge of red deer range, and come the breeding season, because they've dispersed perhaps 20 kilometres ahead of the rest of the Sika population, there aren't any chances to breed with their own type. So they lurk around the outskirts of a red deer harem and grab the mating opportunities that they can. That first cross looks exactly like you've just described. It's a mule. It's something of mixed features halfway between red deer and Sika deer. But actually, thereafter, they tend, again, because the rest of the Sika population may have caught up, or because if it's a hybrid which looks slightly more like a red deer, there are lots of red deer around it, they tend to back cross to one or other of the parental types. So thereafter, this hybrid will either have bred with other Sika animals or animals which look like Sika, and the one that looks like nearly a red deer will tend to breed with red, and very, very quickly, it's called introgression. They seem to revert to the physical appearance of one parental type or the other, but they've got the taint, if I may use that word. It's not really a taint, but they've got that hint of genes from the other species within them.
And what would characterise this? I mean, the question I asked was, there's one of the areas we're going to be looking at that we've shot a lot of really big Sika deer this year, to the extent that when we shared some of the images with colleagues, they went, no, your scales are broken. But I mean, in one area we're seeing, we've been quite vigorous in control, so this could really influence it, but we're seeing quite a high proportion of Sika females with twins in them, which surprised me. So one year I've shot 17 females, 4 of them are carrying twins.
That's a high proportion. I mean, they've always been known to be able to have twins. It's more likely to be due to this higher frequency you're noticing, is more likely to be due to good feeding, good female condition, than it is to whatever the hybrid status is. But going to that hybrid status, all the genetic studies that have been done in recent years would suggest that almost all, if not all, Sika populations in Scotland and in England and Wales are hybrid. In the 70s, I suppose, there were probably two populations which were considered pure Japanese Sika. One in Pixton in Devon, which we know has gone extinct. The other in Doik near Peebles. That one may or may not persist at its core, but it has been subject to incursion with red deer around the edges, and we know there's hybridisation spreading inwards, so I don't suppose it'll last for long. Those were the only two which were known to be brought in directly from Japan. As I say, as far as we know, all current DNA analyses will suggest that every other Sika population in the UK is a hybrid at some level. But because of this back crossing to a parental type, I often say, does it really matter? You've got animals that look like red deer, behave like red deer, smell like red deer, taste like red deer, have antlers like red deer. They're a red deer. Their genetics becomes less significant. You've got animals that look like Sika, taste like Sika, smell like Sika, but have got red deer genes in them. Does it really matter? It's not quite symmetrical. All Sika populations, as far as we know, with the possible exclusion of this one near Peebles, all of them are hybridised to a greater or a lesser extent. All of them have red deer genes. As I say, it's not entirely symmetrical in that the other way doesn't quite work. Some red deer populations certainly are hybridised and have Sika genes in their makeup. But certainly across the Scottish mainland as a whole, the majority seem to remain pure red deer. Not true for the islands, where there have been so many introductions of animals from English deer parks over the years, where there's been a mixture maintained of red deer, Sika, wapiti, whatever else, which all interbreed, that the ones introduced into the Scottish Islands are of a very mongrel mix. But across the mainland, it would appear from the most recent genetic studies that red deer are probably less affected by this introgression of Sika genes than the reverse.
That's interesting. Two things come to mind there. I spent a bit of my time with the Forestry Commission, doesn't make me a bad man. And one of the things I remember...
No, that doesn't make you a bad man. Other things might.
One of the things I remember quite clearly, it was when the big push started, I would think, in the late 1980s and early 90s. We had teams of rangers all over, particularly where we are here on the west coast, where male red deer were shot ruthlessly throughout the year. This was borne out by the Forestry Commission's cull, and I know you've looked at a lot of these data and the percentage of what was male. And I had discussion with a colleague of yours, Josephine Pemberton, and I suggested to Joe that one of the problems I felt came about when Knapdale, Kintyre and North Argyll was that we'd probably supported this advance of the Sika population by so ruthlessly shooting the stags. And
possible.
We had densities, where you had sort of 15 or 16 red females to every red male. And the hybrid swarm that broke out around about, I use the term hybrid swarm, you're probably going to correct me, around about Tavialach and Ford and South Loch Awe. I wonder if the big panic about hybridisation grew from that, when maybe our management practices had instigated it. And the reason I ask this question is that in the change of legislation we see now, we've removed all protection from male deer. Is there a risk to biodiversity, genetics, deer, or is this just an excuse? And are we going to make hybridisation worse and the occurrence of that happen more frequently?
I think you may well be right that by hammering red deer males in that particular area, you increase the hybridisation opportunities for Sika males having access to red females. That is something that hadn't actually occurred to me. I think the pattern of hybridisation suggests that would not have been instrumental in causing the wider problem. It's quite clear that hybridisation spreads as Sika populations spread, and they're spreading at a relatively steady rate wherever there is suitable habitat. So if we have this pattern that young males move out ahead of females, you're always going to have them entering female red deer areas where there are no female Sika deer to breed with. So I suspect that was a problem always going to happen, and it's not something that was exacerbated. Whether or not in the future lack of a male season might increase that risk of hybridisation, I would presumably doubt it, because presumably that heavy pressure on males should apply to Sika as much as it applies to red deer. What does concern me about the abandonment of male seasons, is more a matter of population control, because if people are able to shoot males at any time of year, and if much of our deer management is based on the efforts of recreational stalkers, let's call them hobby stalkers, who go out evenings and weekends to shoot something, there's a tendency that they will end up, if there is no male season, in concentrating their efforts on males, and as a result will shoot fewer females, which is what we actually need to achieve if we're going to control populations. And I'm not suggesting that simply in terms of the fact that hobby stalkers, that's not intended as a pejorative term, people who are doing it in their spare time, not paid for, that they are necessarily trophy hunting and therefore deliberately selecting antlered males. Simply, males tend to be less risk averse than females. So if you're actually out for a limited period of time on the edge of a woodland, and you're waiting simply till the first animal sticks its head out from the woodland edge into open ground, it's going to be a male. And therefore there's a tendency that you will, because of limited time and because of that behavioural tendency of males to be less risk averse, you'll tend to bias the cull towards males. And if you have a limited capacity, your freezer is only so big, or you've only got a limited outlet for sales of venison, then in fact you will satisfy your quota with males and not put sufficient pressure on females. I think that's a far more serious problem.
Okay, yeah. It certainly is a thing that concerns me, because an awful lot of what we're trying to do, there seems to be, particularly in the Highlands and in the north of my mind, a change that for many years Highland sporting estates were the super yacht, and people that owned them had sufficient finance to be able to staff, resource and equip, and part of it was the pleasure of owning and the joy of being involved in deer management. As this shifts and as we move towards this era of new types of landowner, and we'll come back to the carbon offsetting and investment group type, the demand to make deer management pay for itself, it offers a great deal of challenge. And in the past I've operated...
It never can.
Yeah, and I think...
Even you, with your experience of diversification of stalking opportunities, even you, I don't think, could make it do more than wash its face.
That's pretty much... I mean, we're developing, and part of what we're going to look at in the year of Sika, you're absolutely right, is that we're developing a model there where we offer forest owners a management service, and we are going in at a much reduced rate on what the public estate is being charged to shoot deer. The reason I'm doing it is I'm harnessing, you could say, the hobby stalker, the voluntary stalker, to be involved in the management activity by putting them out in high seats, and instead of charging them on the animal way that we used to do, we charge them on a day rate. And we can have one guide supervising 2 or 3 people, and everybody is sufficiently skilled up to DMQ level 2 standard to be able to tell males from females. And in that period, in the winter time of a week, what we've started to do with Sika, because I saw them as sufficiently different, is say, yes, you can shoot male deer in the winter, but in that week you're allowed to shoot 2. Anything after that you pay more, but we want you to focus shooting females, and those you can shoot as many as you get the opportunity to take. And I think models like that have some sort of future on it.
Yeah, I would agree. It's something I think Dick Balharry always encouraged, was the idea of involving local communities particularly, but I don't think it his aspirations were perhaps not as going to be as well policed, and I think people were very worried about letting a bunch of inexperienced people let loose with firearms in a forested area where they would be culling animals, because we know that accidents happen. If it's more controlled, as you were suggesting, then it may have potential.
So the question then has to be, when we look at this greater sea of opinion looking onto the Highlands, I saw a thing on television the other day, and this will start this discussion with you, and it was a herd of fallow deer running over a road in England, and the comment followed was, we should bring back wolves. And I thought, is this to increase the number of RTAs in England? Or so this vision that we're no longer required, having got this whole part of the world into the horlicks we've got it into, we should step back and natural processes will deliver deer management. Can apex predators, can the lynx effect remove the need for the deerstalker?
No. Let's take the two key predators which have been suggested. And again, we have to accept that this is my opinion, but it is based on experience in reading the literature and experience talking with colleagues in countries in continental Europe. If we start with wolves, the population, all the population modelling that I have seen suggests that there is nowhere in the UK with enough land area and a sufficient density of deer to sustain long term a pack of wolves. As numbers would increase, I mean, in the early days, of course, then if there were only a few animals around and there were lots of red deer or roe deer to eat, then they would prosper if they didn't diversify into eating hill sheep. But as they prosper, so they will increase their reproductive rate, so they will actually increase the pack size, and at the same time they will be depleting the local deer populations. So now a larger number of wolves is trying to sustain itself on a smaller number of deer. Ultimately, without dispersal into new areas, that ain't going to be sustainable. And there are relatively few areas in the UK, and such a reintroduction would have to occur in Scotland. There are relatively few large enough areas of uninterrupted suitable habitat that aren't broken up and fragmented by anthropogenic impact. So I think there's no question, but both the English and the Scottish governments have said that they would not support such a reintroduction. Lynx are a different kettle of fish. They're actually quite interesting, and if people wanted to reintroduce them simply to restore a missing piece of our fauna, you were talking about going back to the sort of post-boreal period where we had a wider biodiversity, particularly of larger mammals, then I might actually be quite interested if that was the justification. To try and justify it on the basis that it would control deer numbers which are spiralling out of control irritates me, because it's such a spurious argument. For a start, it presumes that deer numbers cannot be controlled by human activity, which is something I don't accept. I think wherever deer numbers have started increasing to a point where they are causing conflict, increased hunter effort from humans has in general controlled that situation. So I don't believe they are spiralling out of control in a way that humans can't manage them. And secondly, when you look at the behaviour of lynx, they're solitary. They have huge home ranges, enormous home ranges, thousands of hectares, which they defend against others of their own sex. So a male lynx will defend his territory effectively, his defended home range, against other males, females likewise against other females. These huge home ranges therefore have one animal within them, and they are capable of killing up to a yearling red deer, but they tend to concentrate on roe. as you will know. And the estimate is they probably kill 30 to 40 roe deer a year, tops. That's not going to control a deer population. 30 or 40 roe deer in an area of over 1,000, perhaps 1,500 hectares. That's not going to have a significant impact on deer populations. So I get frustrated because it's so often put forward as an argument for the reintroduction that they will take care of expanding deer populations, and it's completely false.
Interesting. So a couple of things, digressing back again, that you've explained to me in the past, and for people watching this I'd love you to do again, is to go through the differences in habitat use between males and females, why particularly cervidae live at periods of the year in separate groups, and just basically catch on things of what hind densities mean about stag densities and distribution and that sort of thing, and how it influences red and Sika.
It's probably, it depends very much on the breeding system, and I don't mean the breeding strategy. We've talked about whether you hold a territory and attract females to that territory, whether you hold a harem so that it's the females which are the defended resource, whether you have a lek, whether you forage for estrus females. That's the breeding strategy. The breeding system, by that I mean whether or not you are relatively monogamous as roe deer, solitary roe deer. Classic tale is that a male will breed with females whose home ranges his territory overlaps. It's actually an oversimplification. Females may make mating excursions to go and sample other males in the area with whom they may choose to mate. So female actually does retain an element of mate choice, but nonetheless it's usually one male to one or two females. Contrast that with what are called polygynous mating systems, where one male may command the mating opportunities to lots of females. So that, for example, in Simon Thurgood's studies in the New Forest on fallow deer, he found that of 30 males that he studied, the majority of 90% of the matings of females were carried out by three males, and a lot of the rest got no mating opportunities at all. So you've got haves and have-nots in the mating stakes. In those species where one male may command the mating opportunities over lots of females, there is huge competition amongst the males come the mating season, and for that reason males develop much bigger body size than females to aid the sexual competition. So a roe deer buck is about the same size as a roe deer doe. Red deer, a male will be anything up to 50% heavier and more massive than a female. So you've got an animal which is larger, therefore requires a greater food intake, but has a greater capacity to digest cellulose, plant cell walls, the more indigestible, coarser forages, because he's got a larger rumen. So in essence, I mean, Tim Clutton-Brock and Steve Alban and Fiona Guinness wrote a book, Red Deer, The Ecology of Two Sexes, and effectively they are almost two different species in that sense, in that they have different requirements, and that may be met in different habitats, so that a smaller bodied female requires quite a high intake of relatively digestible food because she can't digest coarse forage as well as a male, and so they will tend to focus on areas of good grazing. It might be clearings within woodlands, it might be grasslands adjacent to a woodland, it might be high altitude greens on the open hill. But they will tend to commandeer those, and because they're smaller bodied, and because their muzzles are smaller, they can crop the sward very much closer than can males, which actually means that males can't sustain their larger body mass on the amount of food intake they would get in these areas where females have cropped the ground so close. So there are other contributing factors why they tend to segregate into groups of a single sex anyway, but that would explain why those groups of males or those groups of females tend to separate geographically and occupy different habitats. And it's notable that in a number of areas where I've worked, and it's often been the stalker rather than me who has suggested this, where they have deliberately reduced the density of females in hitherto female areas, hind ground as we might call it. Once you've reduced those below a certain level, you find it recolonised by males who can now actually get access to good grazing of higher quality than what they've been forced into by the competition. And we can take that a bit further, because that is also an explanation why in general in competition between species, so not now between the sexes within a species, but between species, it's usually the smaller species which can outcompete the larger one, because they need less food in the first place to sustain their metabolism and their activity and to keep them in prime condition. But in addition, they can always crop the ground closer and therefore, in a sense, deny the larger species the opportunity to get a sufficient intake. So both between the sexes of one species and between different species where they may co-occur in the same area, you'll always find it's the smaller one that outcompetes the larger one.
Interesting. So leading on from that, Rory, just for myself and for everybody that's looking on, I'm getting a clear understanding there that you're convinced that smaller animals will therefore dominate the situation. So if we're looking at Sika, classic example this year, it's been a really wet, long, horrible winter in the north and the west. I think the whole of the UK has had a lot of rain. And red deer, towards the end of the red deer cull we were doing, were thin. There's already reports of quite a bit of mortality in places both in and out of woodland. And yet the Sika deer in almost exactly the same habitat, and very often exactly the same habitat, are still fat. And that's one of my questions for you. And in this whole evolution of landscape that we're trying to create, and I think a lot of this is human vision of how the land must look, not how nature would like to steer it. Am I wrong in thinking that the Sika are likely to be the game winner?
Winner or loser, I wouldn't say the winners, but I mean, going on from what we were saying before, it's certainly true that smaller animals tend to be able to cope better, tend to be able to dominate better. Because they are smaller, they don't need as much food to keep them in good condition. They can, with smaller muzzles, they can crop grazing swards closer, they can pluck nutritious buds and shoots from trees better, and so they are better able to maintain a good quality and quantity of food intake than larger animals in the same environment. And it's a classic across the UK, wherever we have 2 or 3 or 4 species co-occurring, it's always the smaller species that seem to do better and be able to displace, in some cases, the larger species. So yes, I'm not particularly surprised that you're finding that smaller Sika deer are doing, or Sika-like deer, of course, because they're hybrids, are doing better than larger bodied red deer, because they don't need so much food to maintain good body condition, and they're better equipped to get it from restricted resources.
So in the terms of Sika, again, I've been told by a number of different sources, and I won't name them, well I could,
I can probably guess.
There's more than one there's more than one Japanese Sika, that there are a lot of subspecies within Japan. Is that an old wives' tale, or are there
It's an old wives' tale.
Okay.
It's a complete old wives' tale. The early taxonomic definitions Ellerman and Scott in the 50s defined, I think, 13 different subspecies of Sika, all occurring in Japan. The genetics that have been undertaken since the discovery of, or the development of DNA analyses suggest that there are two basic genetic types, not 13. And as far as we are aware, the only Sika animals imported into the UK come from the genetic type which is clustered around Nagasaki in Japan. So no, we have one genetic type of Sika-like animals.
Okay, excellent. So would it follow then that like sort of Manchurian Sika, and then there was this argument for a while they were Formosan Sika, and then they existed and then they didn't, and then some people saying Dabrowski's deer are all Japanese Sika that have adapted?
No. Well,
Explain.
it's an oversimplification. Manchurian Sika probably are a different genetic type, and as you know, they are characterised by having very striking red velvet on their antlers during development. We do not think they've ever established in the wild state, is probably the simplest answer. I may be proven wrong, but they're certainly not widely established. Dabrowski's and Manchurian are more or less the same thing. Dabrowski's have become established as a hybrid population in the Czech Republic. As far as I know, they're because, as I say, I equate them effectively with Manchurian Sika, they do not occur in the wild state in the UK.
So it's Japanese, or
well,
Japanese-like. Okay, I must change my terminology.
It's Japanese-like.
Japanese-like, excellent. So in this whole move towards a more biodiverse, more wooded Scotland, more wooded UK, am I wrong in thinking? I mean, am I wrong in thinking they're the winner? Is it just because I find them harder to cull? Is it because they are more secretive that they have a chance of winning, or is this just a presumption that's not based on science?
I don't think they will ever completely displace red deer, certainly in Scotland. And in England, as you know, current Sika populations tend to be much more localised. They're spreading quite widely throughout the Scottish mainland. In England, Sika populations, and in Wales, Sika populations are much more localised and haven't begun to spread yet. They will, in my opinion. There are two, it's a slight digression, but there are two basic forms of dispersion in Sika. In areas of continuous habitat, they spread steadily, and that's what we see for the most part in Scotland. In areas where the populations are localised, they tend to stay where they are until they've built up a particularly high density, and then they explode from that area. So effectively they will stay contained in a relatively small area, and this is exactly what happened in the Kintyre Peninsula south of the Crinan Canal. They stayed there and built up almost exceptional numbers and then suddenly exploded outwards. That tends to be the pattern where the populations are isolated, and I would guess that's going to be the pattern in England and Wales. That to begin with, they will stay within high density local populations and then eventually will erupt. As far as are they going to be the winners, they're certainly going to take advantage of situations where suitable habitat is created and made available to them. But I don't think at any point, certainly as I say in Scotland, are they ever in our lifetimes ever going to displace red deer completely, particularly because red deer have proven themselves very adaptable to the open hill situation, whereas Sika will use open hill habitats but are much more a woodland species. They tend to be characteristic of much more acid ground and therefore commercial plantations of commercial conifers rather than adapting to a wider diversity of habitat. But that may change as the habitat changes. I think in pursuing ambitious plans for woodland expansion, accepting that the UK has a very poor proportion of woodland cover compared to many European countries, I think in developing those ambitious plans, there are two issues for deer managers. First of all, that numbers will have to be, or impacts will have to be kept low while new plantings are established or regeneration is established around existing woodlands. But once the targets have been met and we have a much larger woodland resource spread as stepping stones across the country, then of course deer are going to take full advantage of that, and then there may be a real problem of coping with deer numbers and impacts in what is actually, as you know from your own experience, a difficult environment in which to control numbers.
Leading from that, the Deer Working Group, which is driving a lot of the legislation that is coming forward at the moment, as one of its targets said it was to halt the spread of Sika. In none of the proposals I've seen in the last 3 or 4 years have they ever been addressed again. But I'm intrigued that the Cairngorms National Park Authority has as a target not having Sika. But in that same working group report it said, give up, it's too late. There's no such thing as pure red deer. Is government missing a trick here? Should they be more robust? Is it a pointless target of the Cairngorms to say we don't have them when they're already there?
Two questions you've tied up in there really. First of all, there is such a thing as a pure red deer. The most recent genetic work suggests, as I said, that hybridisation and introgression of alien genes into the other species is not symmetrical. And so while almost all Sika-like animals that look like Sika are hybrids, the consensus is that the majority of red deer populations in the north and west, not the southwest of Scotland where the populations, as you know, in Galloway were introduced, but the majority of populations in mainland Scotland to the north and west are red deer. So that's one thing out of the way. Can they remove Sika? No. Can you stop the spread? You can slow it. Most deer management groups with which I've worked over the years have always had a policy of zero tolerance, and Sika, as soon as they are spotted in the area where they haven't been before, will be shot on sight. So I guess you can probably slow the spread. It's difficult because, going back to what we were just saying about woodland expansion and what I said earlier about Sika being relatively hard to detect within woodland, if you see Sika on the open hill for the first time, Sika stags coming into your area and they are obvious on the open hill, yes, you can probably contain that spread for a while. Once we've got virtually continuous stepping stones of forest, you won't even notice they're in there. And my concern would be that they will just spread regardless. But that's a general problem with deer management strategies for all species in the whole of the UK, that there is going to become a point where the capacity for deer management doesn't stretch as far as the management need. When you've got a system which is largely based, as we said earlier, on recreational stalkers in their spare time, then there will come a break point where the management need outstrips the number of recreational stalkers and the hours that they can put in. And that is a problem that we're backing ourselves into that corner. There was an interesting study done in Norway about 10, 15 years ago, where they appreciated that this was a risk, that the numbers of recreational stalkers was declining, the age structure was changing so that the stalker population was getting older and older and older. But at the same time, deer populations were increasing in numbers and range, and they developed a number of models, a number of scenarios to explore what would happen. And the conclusion from all of those scenarios was that within about 30 years, management need would outstrip management capacity. And I suspect we will, to the extent that we also base our deer management policy on recreational stalkers, I suspect sooner or later that's going to be a risk here.
It's interesting. And do you think new advances in technology will make a big difference?
No.
I'm not convinced either. Rory, thank you very much for your time. It's much appreciated.